Hello my friends and welcome to the channel for another Escape from Tarkov video. In this one, I want to take a look at two of my favorite rifles in Tarkov, the M4A1 and the HK416. Compare a few builds and talk about which one I think is better and why. I'm going to take a look at an all-out meta build and more of a mid-range build for both of these guns, and compare their price, availability, and how they feel to use in different situations. The M4 and the 416 are pretty similar rifles. They use the same ammo, they both can use the same suppressors, pistol grips, stocks, and even some vital parts like charging handles. Both rifles are pretty accurate even at fairly long range, but they definitely shine at close to medium range because they both have a fairly high fire rate, which makes them great at any range where you can hold multiple shots on target effectively, which is definitely an advantage in a head-to-head gunfight around the corner. Both the M4 and the 416 can be built to have very controllable recoil, but personally I think the biggest difference between the M4 and the HK when it comes to builds is that the M4 has a lot more options when it comes to barrel lengths for a few different reasons. First, the M4 simply has more options for barrels, and it even has upgraded versions of the mid-length barrels in the form of the Hansen 13 and 16-inch barrels. The second and honestly more important reason the M4 can make shorter barrels work more effectively is because the M4 has a lot more parts that can be upgraded to influence the stats compared to the HK416. And because of this, the barrel length has a bigger impact on the overall recoil of a 416 build. On the M4, you can upgrade the gas block, the barrel, upper receiver, and buffer tube with parts that reduce recoil and often raise ergonomics at a pretty reasonable price. The 416, on the other hand, can only replace one of those four parts, the barrel. On top of this, the best handguards for the 416 can only be used with the longest barrel, meaning you kind of have to use that long barrel to get access to the best upgrades for ergonomics. So while you can build a 416 that has great recoil stats and lets you spray long full auto bursts very comfortably, you're almost always going to end up with a gun that's longer and heavier than an M4 with similar recoil. Let's compare some actual builds so you can kind of see what I mean. For these builds, I'll be going for what I would say is the meta after the recoil rework in this patch, which focuses on lowering recoil as much as possible while also prioritizing high ergonomics wherever possible. Both of these builds cost about the same amount at around 300,000 rubles. We'll start with the 416, and the first big addition on this one will obviously be the 20-inch barrel, which has the best recoil reduction of all the options and also lets you attach the handguards with the biggest stat bonuses. For a suppressor on this build, I'm running the Griffin Armament M4SD suppressor, which is very expensive but makes up for it by having both amazing recoil stats and one of the lowest ergonomics penalties. For the handguard, this is using the Strike Industries Crux handguard, which reduces recoil by 3 points and boosts ergonomics by 11 points. For comparison, the only real option for an upgraded handguard on a shorter barrel for the 416 is the Midwest M-Lock handguard, which has no recoil reduction and only 8 points of ergonomics. For a grip on this build, I've got the SE5 Express foregrip, which has an amazing balance of ergonomics and recoil. For the stock, I'm using the Daniel Defense ECB stock, which again just has an amazing balance between ergo and recoil. And it can also take two different butt pads, one for a recoil boost and one for an ergonomics boost. Finally, to increase the ergonomics on the build, I've got the Grawl S pistol grip, an avalanche charging handle, and one backup iron sight. With this build, you end up with 60 recoil and about 55 ergonomics, which is quite respectable. 55 ergonomics is pretty solid on any build, and even with the high rate of fire of the 416, that recoil is low enough that you can pretty easily hold shots on target in full auto. The downsides of the long barrel really only come into play when you're fighting in very close quarters, or when you're stuck tight against your cover and your gun barrel pops up so you can't aim or shoot where you want to, which can be a heartbreaking way to lose a fight. Now for comparison, let's check out an M4A1 with about the same amount of money put into upgrading it. First up, I'm going to swap out the barrel for the Hansen 13.7-inch barrel. Then I swap the upper receiver for the AX15 receiver, and the buffer tube with the SI Advanced buffer tube. Finally, I replaced the gas block with the Ballistic Advantage Low Pro gas block. With just these upgrades to the core parts on the M4, I've basically already matched the recoil reduction of the 416 with a long barrel, but this one is over 6 inches shorter, making it much easier to use in tight spaces. For the handguard on this one, I'm running the Alexander Arms MK10 handguard, which gets some great stat bonuses for a pretty reasonable price, and it can be used with almost every barrel length on the M4. For the rest of the parts on this build, it's exactly the same as the 416. A Griffin Armament M4 SD suppressor, SE5 Express grip, Daniel Defense ECB stock with the butt pad, a Grawl S pistol grip, Avalanche charging handle, and 1 backup iron sight. With this build, when it's all put together, it ends up with 55 recoil and 74 ergonomics. The recoil is pretty damn close between the two, but the M4 really takes the lead with almost 20 extra ergonomics than the 416, which means it can have about 50 ergonomics even with a drum mag attached. Then when you consider that it's also 6 inches shorter and 1 kilogram lighter than the 416, the advantages of the M4 start to tip the scales a little bit. In my opinion, the faster time to kill of the 416 is offset pretty effectively by the M4 being shorter, lighter, and much snappier with that high ergonomics, making it just easier to use in certain situations. But that's not where this comparison ends. Personally, I think the final nail in the coffin of the 416 comes when you compare a more mid-range setup that doesn't have 300,000 rubles put into it. For this comparison, we're going to check out 2 builds that are both about 175,000 rubles. And you should be able to see how much bigger the gap is on the stats of these 2 rifles when you don't have best-in-slot attachments. For the HK, we'll start by swapping out to the 16.5 inch barrel for a bit of recoil reduction, and then add the KAC NT4 suppressor. Next, I add on the Midwest M-Lock 9 inch handguard and a Magpul RVG foregrip for some extra stats. For pistol grip, I'm going with the F1 Skeleton pistol grip, and for the stock, I'm using the VL Tor E-Mod stock, which is a pretty good balance of recoil and ergonomics. Finally, I'm also adding a pair of backup iron sights for 2 more points of ergo. With this build, I end up with 69 vertical recoil and about 48 ergonomics. Pretty decent stats for a simple build on a 416, and after the recoil rework, the setup is still pretty controllable even on full auto, so it's not a bad build. But in just a minute, you'll see how easy it is to set up a significantly better M4 build for the same amount of money. So right off the bat, you might think it's cheating, but we're going to start off with a barter trade for this build. The 416 unfortunately just doesn't have any good barter trades like this, but the M4 has several, which is another advantage of picking that over a 416. My favorite barter trade is to do 4 GP coins for the M4A1 LVOA build, which comes with a lot of upgrades pre-installed, including a really good receiver, handguard, charging handle, and the same E-Mod stock that I used on the 416. For the upgrades on this build, I'm basically adding the same parts that I used on the 416. The KAC NT4 suppressor, an F1 Skeleton pistol grip, an RVG foregrip, and then a pair of backup iron sights for +2 ergonomics. The only extra addition is that I also added the RTM ATP buffer tube as a really cheap upgrade that just adds some extra stats. When this build is all put together, you end up with 59 vertical recoil, which is 10 points lower than the 416, and about 58 ergonomics, which again is about 10 points higher than the 416, for almost an identical price. So there are 2 different builds for each rifle that cost almost the same amount of money. And in both cases, the M4 comes out with better stats in both recoil and ergonomics. And in both cases, the M4 is shorter and lighter than the 416 as well. Now obviously the on-paper stats don't tell the whole story. While the M4 has lower recoil stats, the 416 is still a pretty controllable gun to shoot. And the high fire rate on the 416 does mean that sometimes you will win trades that you might have lost with an M4 simply because you have more bullets coming out. The long barrel 416 also has a higher muzzle velocity, and technically it has better accuracy as well. So if you're making a shot at 200 meters or further, that might actually be the difference between a hit and a miss. But if it's my money and I'm picking between an M4 and a 416, I'm going to go for the M4 every time. I really prefer having a lighter, smaller rifle, so running a 416 with that big 20-inch barrel just doesn't really do it for me. Because the M4 has so many small, cheap upgrades to improve the stats like the gas block, buffer tube, and receiver, I just find it easier and cheaper to set up a good M4 build at any price point. The sheer amount of aftermarket parts available for the M4 also means that you can just have a lot more versatility in how you build it and how you want it to look if that's your thing. You can make an M4 with an 11-inch barrel that feels just as good to shoot as a 416 with a 20-inch barrel, and to me, that's just a huge advantage. If the 416 had more parts and more options for core stat upgrades that don't involve adding a 20-inch barrel, my opinion might be different, but it doesn't, so I'm sticking with my trusty M4. And that basically covers it for this one. I hope you enjoyed this format, and if you did or didn't, I'd appreciate it if you let me know down in the comments. I'd like to do similar videos covering other competitive weapons like the MDR versus the SA58 or the SR25 versus the G28, so suggestions about what weapons to pit against each other would be good too. Thanks for checking out the video. I've got a link to my Twitch channel down in the description for anyone interested, and until next time, stay safe in Tarkov City.